absence this evening, so I'll embarrass him by doing this. But Amit Sen is with us this evening from the University of Memphis. If you've had the chance to look at Hippolyte's Logic and Existence, he's the co-translator of that text, and he's also, let's say, a long-standing grad student, a friend of mine, put it that way. We were in grad school together back in whatever the days were, and so it's a privilege to have him here. He's thought more things than I can probably ever think about Hegel, knows more about Hegel than I'll ever know about Hegel, so he'll, it's always embarrassing for me to present in front of him all this stuff, so he'll correct me after class. He's always gracious to do that. So. Yes, true. Yeah. Okay. All right. Get this going. Sorry. All right. So what we want to do today is try to make it through as much of measure from quantity into measure as we possibly can. As is usual, I'm going to leave off the transition into essence tonight, right? So that we'll take up and start next week with. You should have read it. If you read it and thought, my God, how does that happen, right? I mean, that's kind of an experience you'll have for most of the transitions in the book, so let's just be honest about that to start off from. But if you read that particular one and thought, oh my God, I really have no clue about how we get from being, measure, to essence, be here next week. I'm not claiming I'll figure it out for you, but we'll commiserate together, right? We'll try to figure out how that's supposed to work, what that substrate and states thing is supposed to be, and how all that leads necessarily to what he calls relativity and reflection, and how that's supposed to get us to essence proper, and why that then means we have to think of being as sein and shine, and we'll go from there, right? But leave that for next week. This week, my main goal is to get us to think about why we must move from quantity to measure, which is tough enough, right? Because measure is the necessary interrelation of quality and quantity. So it's not the case, right, that the account of being ends by saying, well, we started in quality, then we had to go over to quantity, and then we moved from there to measure. What Hegel actually argues, right, is that quality necessarily entails quantity. That we've seen, we'll come back and talk about it, right? But then quantity necessarily entails quality. And because they necessarily entail one another, the truth of each one is the truth of the other one, right? They're reciprocally the case of the truth of each other. Because that's the case, then we have to think of them at their relationship as measure. So measure is the relationship of quality and quantity. So you thought you were finished with quality, you're not. It comes back here in a very interesting, important way. Then he wants, so that's the first thing that we'll try to deal with tonight, right? Just how do you move from quantity to measure in this way? Why does quantity necessarily entail that? And a lot of that's bound up with this notion of quantitative infinity, which is where we ended with last time, and I'm going to come back to that to begin today. So we'll go quantitative infinity to this notion of ratios, right? Ratios, which will help us, and we'll talk about what those are and what that means. But then the other big question is, okay, if we get to measure is the relationship between quality and quantity, how are we supposed to understand that? We'll look at this thing he invokes there, famously called the nodal lines, right? So we'll talk about the nodal lines and how that helps us think through that relationship. But why that ultimately leads to what he calls the measureless, right? Why that's another form of infinity, as we'll see. And then why that entails the move into essence, we'll save for next week. So I'm sorry to end the Doctrine of Being every week. Our readings of the Doctrine of Being tend to end on infinity every week, right? This version of the spurious infinite, right? The bad infinite, the non-finite infinite, and this infinity as a process, infinitizing. We tend to end every week with that, but I think that that's appropriate to what's going on in the Doctrine of Being, and to leave us with that question, why does this entail the next thing, is the right thing to be thinking about in Hegel. Among the many other questions we might have about just, what does any of this mean, what is he trying to say, that kind of stuff. All right, so that's the basic program for what we're going to be doing tonight. Questions, problems, or issues before I get going? Good. Thank you. All right. So let's talk about then, just remind ourselves about the transition from quality to quantity, Remember, the claim here, and this is just, I want to come back to this because it's so important for everything that we're going to do in quantity. So spend a bit of time about this again. I've schematized the argument here for you. So that's why I wanted to bring this up. It's on D2L, and you can have it in front of you. Let me a little larger so you can see it better. So all I'm trying to do here is just track the argumentation by putting it in premise conclusion form. I don't think there's anything special or magical about putting it in this form. Doesn't make it now properly logical. It just really, I find helpful to say, okay, this thesis, that thesis entails this, and they build on that claim to lead to this. So tracking the argumentation that Hegel is doing in a very dense way, but I think this accurately does track what he does in fact say in this text. So that's what I'm trying to get at. So the question, right, is always something like this when you're trying to think about these transitions. Why is this imminent and necessarily that? Right? So why is quality imminently and necessarily quantity? So Hegel's claim is that the complete determination of being as existence is Dasein. The culmination of that account is that it's a unity, what he calls a one, that is ultimately and wholly indifferent to its own determinacy. So remember, we start off with Dasein, existence, and we say, well, look, it has these two moments of reality and negation. It's being that is non-being, right? Reality that is negation. Negation is always working to produce some kind of reality, and we notice that eventually what that means is that reality has a self-relatedness, has a oneness about it, that's completely and totally beholden to the work of negation. Negation is what engenders, what produces that self-relation. And at the end of that process, that negation has actually been incorporated into, been integrated into the oneness itself, such that even it doesn't stand outside, logically outside, extrinsic to the self-relating of oneness itself. Well, that moment, the Führerstein, right, being for itself, right, being for self, that moment is where negation has been wholly and completely incorporated, integrated within self-relation. Well, that means there is no determination then of quality over and beyond that. Quality is completely and fully determinate, but surprisingly, at its height of determinacy, it's indifferent to its own determinacy. There is no determination to be made of it anymore. It's complete and full in its determination. So this repulsion from itself, which it now includes within itself, the negation of itself, is simply producing of many ones, many self-relations, not quantitatively distinct ones. It can't be, we don't have quantity yet. But it's the cloning, to use that expression again, of the one, of self-relation, and it's producing of many of those, but all those are attracted back because they're all one, right? They're all still parts or reproductions of that same self-relation. So what we have at the end of quality, the end of the account of existence in terms of quality, is we have this notion of the oneness of all things that is forged by its repulsion and attraction. Its repulsion and attraction. And in that he says, this is on page 145 again, in the translation 166 in the German, that in being, but it is indifferent to it. It's indifferent to its own being. So you'll find this oftentimes in Hegel. Hegel will lay out the development of something and show you where it becomes most determinate, right? Where it becomes most determinate. So if you say, what's the most determinate stage in the account of quality? You would say, well, it's oneness and manyness. That's the most determinate form that quality as reality takes. And yet precisely at that very moment, because it's completely and totally incorporated this othering, this otherness, negation within itself, what do you have? It's most indifferent, it's most indeterminate as well. So Hegel will show you this repeatedly, that just when you think you're at the culmination of quality, which you are, you're also simultaneously at its most indifferent, gleichgültig, right? It's indifferent to itself. It doesn't have any, it doesn't matter, right? There's no determination to it. So as he says, this is on page 152. This is the first paragraph on 152, 173 in the German. He says, quality is the first immediate determinant. Quantity is the determinant that has become indifferent to being. So notice what he's saying there. Quantity doesn't subsume quality. Quantity just names quality. Quantity just names quality in quality's full and complete determination, when it's completely indifferent to itself. So quality is the first immediate determinant. Quantity is the determinant that has become indifferent, gleichgültig, to being. A limit which is just as much no limit. Being for itself, so there's that moment, the last stage of quality. being for itself, which is absolutely identical with being for other. The repulsion of the many ones, which is immediately non-repulsion, their continuity. So quantity just names that final moment, that thinking now of being, right? Not as reality and negation, but the thinking of being demanded here, which is being as pure magnitude, mass, in those terms. Let's use those terms generically here. He also says on page 154, so a couple pages over from that, 176, this is the first page there, 176 in the German, 154 in the English. He writes this: quantity, just making the same point again. So these two passages are saying the exact same thing. I just simply want to point it back out. We've been through it before. But I want to note what he adds here in 1832. So this is Hegel saying, I always think when Hegel adds something, he's like, emphasizes something, not just changes it, but elaborates it. That's when he thinks a point's really central, right? So he writes here, and this is all from 1812, this is already there. Quantity is sublated being for itself. Sublated being for itself. So how would you define quantity at the first level? Quantity is sublated being for itself. But you know what being for itself is? That's the highest determination of quality. So you could also just write that same formulation as quantity is sublated quality. Now that doesn't help you a lot, unless you know what quality being sublated means. But that's the short expression of its statement of formulation of it. Then he expands upon that. The repelling one that behaved only negatively toward the excluded one, now that it, the repelling one, having passed over in relation to it, the excluded one, the repelling one behaves towards the other as identical to itself and has therefore lost its determination. Quality has lost its determination. Quality has lost its determination. Being for itself has passed over into attraction. Look, this is all review at that point, right? He's telling you this is where we've been, right? We all know this at this point. This is kind of the phrasing of this passage. Then he says, the absolute obdurancy, or fragility, Freudigkeit, of the repelling, and I think that's missing in Di Giovanni, right? Of the repelling one, right? So it's not there, it's added. It should be added, it's there in the German. So it should read the absolute obdurancy of the repelling one, right? So that's what it should say. Of the repelling one has melted away, it's dissolved, zerflossen, right? It's dissolved, it's flown away, into this unity which, however, as containing the one is at the same time determined by the repulsion residing within it. Now that's where he stops in 1812, right? That's the original expression of it. And that's just really, Hegel's quick, admittedly simple, abstract, but accurate way of summarizing the entirety of the culmination of quality. But in 1832, he looks at that and goes, that's a really significant point. That's how we get to quantity. So he expands it, right? He adds a bit more to it. Here's what he says in 1832. You have it here. It's just the rest of this passage is from 1831, actually, when he actually expands it. He says, as unity of the self-externality, literally of the unity of being outside itself. You have, I think, self-externality, or literally being outside itself. Außersein. It is unity with itself. It's both completely other than itself, but it's with itself in that otherness. The traction is in this way the moment of continuity in quantity. There he's pointing you ahead, right? So quantity is not something that's overtaken quality. Quantity names the completion, the culmination of quality itself. So in both of those passages, the central defining difference between the two forms of determinacy, the difference between qualitative and quantitative determinacy, is the fact that in quantity, the limit, the Grenze, if you want to go back to the terminology he was using early in quality. In quantity, the limit, the otherness or negation by which existence is set out or marked out as distinctly existing, that is possessing the quality of being real, it plays no such role now. Because it's not extrinsic. It's nothing for it to negate. It's completely and wholly, let me use a problematic term, subsumed. I like better, incorporated, integrated within it. Negation plays no such role here, no determining role here, because, as Hegel shows, the movement by which reality is what it is, namely true infinity, being for itself, expressed in the form of the attraction of all qualitative ones, all self-relations, into the oneness of reality, is, as he says, quote, completely identical with, or as we just saw a moment ago, melted away or dissolved into being for other. Being for itself is completely and totally dissolved in being for other. the repulsion of this oneness whereby all ones come to be. As a result of this indeterminate identity, this indefinite unity, being for itself is an ontological category of determinacy that has integrated all otherness within itself and thus paradoxically rendered itself indeterminate. So if negation is what determines reality, what gives it its specificity, what gives it its uniqueness, its distinctness, then the incorporation of negation, which is what the incorporation of repulsion into itself is, surprisingly renders it indeterminate. So this indeterminate identity, being for itself now, it has lost its determination, as he says, and he designates this through that notion of the indifferent. The indifferent. Now, if that's right, then I think tracking this argument begins to make a little bit of sense. Just walk through it with me for just a moment here. Take the first premise. The sublation of one and many is initially relative in that it is in relation with two distinct moments, one and many. As a result, it is determinate. We're still back in quality. But this relation is nothing other than the process of becoming other, repulsion as he calls it there, in order to become what it is, attraction there. So conclusion, consequently the moments of the relation, which had initially been distinct, are now blended into one another. Repulsion just is attraction. Attraction just is repulsion. They are identified. So Hegel wants to say that's an achievement. You need to understand that does constitute a definite stage of quality. Then he says, for the moments of a relation to be equated as referring to the same process, attraction and repulsion is just one process, is for them to no longer be held distinct against one another. So the next conclusion, the one we've just been talking about, they sink into one another, they go together with themselves. The one is simultaneously determined as having gone beyond itself and as unity. The one, the absolutely determined unit, is posited as the limit, which is none, no limit, a limit which is in being but is indifferent to it. That's the last sentence on 145, 166 in the journal. Now, if that makes some sense, and I always just try to highlight this because it's important for what's included in this transition. It follows from that for anything to be real, for anything to exist, for it to be at all, according to Hegel, it must be a quantity. It must be a magnitude. It can't just be real. It can't just be qualitative. It can't just be real and then have negation burden. It can't be just burdened with negation. And then when it incorporates that, okay, now we're finished with it, now we're done. Now we can just be real, right? That moment of reality is nothing other than magnitude because it's completely incorporated all othering, all negation within itself. So to be real is to be magnitude. So to be quantitatively determined, and as we're about to see, to be quantitatively determined will mean that it has to be discrete. It also has to be continuous, as we talked about last week. But it's discrete, then we can say to be is to be a being, and entity. It's the first time you can say this in the logic, right? Up to this point you could say, what is it to be? To be is to be real. And what does that mean? It's afflicted with negation. That's the way we started the discussion of reality and negation. But that leads to something in other. That leads to this relationship that gives us the qualitative infinity. And eventually, where does that lead us to? It leads us to this being for itself that is being for other. Attraction and repulsion. But that's where we've incorporated negation fully within to reality. Or to put it in broader terms, we've completely incorporated non-being within being. Then we are left with magnitude. But if, as he shows, magnitude has to necessarily be discrete, cut off, distinguished, a quantum, as he's about to say, a number, as he's about to say, then it's also continuous at the same time. Then we can say for the first time, what is it to be? It's not just to be real, but it's to be a reality that has a magnitude. And as you might guess, what we're going to say after that is what it is to be not just real and not just a magnitude, but to be measurable. That's where we're headed. Make a little bit of sense? We did that last time. I just wanted to come back and touch on the basic points of that again to put that in place. So Hegel is, in a paradoxical way, right? Hegel is saying quality comes before quantity. Right? He is saying that. He's literally claiming quality comes first. But that's not because quality is more foundational. It's exactly the opposite, actually. Right? He's saying quality is at the surface level, right? Just like being is. It's slightly more determinate than being is. That's all it is. But when you follow it through, it necessarily entails that it be something more than that. That is, that it is magnitude, that it is quantity. And as retrogressive ground, right, then quantity is what makes possible quality, and all that's what makes possible being. So when we say, what is it to be, and we say to be is to be real, and to be is to be magnitude, we're actually saying that more fundamental than reality is magnitude. You don't have reality without magnitude. That's Hegel's claim. Now, we're about to go a lot further than even that, but that's at least where, if you stop at this point, that's at least the proof. That's what it's demonstrates. All right. Make a little bit of sense? Questions? Have we lost people at that point? Questions, problems, issues? Then let's look at section 2 again, magnitude. This is quantity. This is chapters 1 and 2, quantity and quantum. I'm going to take a look back at those for just a moment. We'll review here, and then we'll launch into the end of that discussion in quantity with the quantitative infinity and see where that takes us. So magnitude is that which can be increased or diminished without changing what it is. Magnitude is that which can be increased or diminished without changing what it is. At least that's where we're going to start with it. It'll get more complex in just a moment, but this is its indeterminacy that it possesses, right? It doesn't matter whether there's a lot of it or a little of it, doesn't matter. It's a magnitude. It is, my term, not Hegel's, a blob. It's a mass. It's an indeterminate, indefinite immediacy whose increase or decrease makes no difference, makes no determination to it. Existence is thus an indefinite mass or magnitude, as Hegel calls it. But, and this is very standard procedure for Hegel at this point. Just because you've reached magnitude doesn't mean you've reached something that has nothing within it. It still has determinacy born with it, but the determinacy is now born within it. Negation doesn't come along and attack it from without. Right? It bears that negation already within it. How so? Well, repulsion is still there. Repulsion hasn't stopped repulsing. Right? Retraction hasn't stopped attracting. So how does that actually work in terms of magnitude? It works this way. It forces magnitude to be at once continuous attraction held together, so it's a continuity, but also discrete repulsion. So now we can talk about not just magnitude and mass, we can talk about discrete entities for the first time for this reason. So Hegel's claim is that because of that contradiction, because intrinsic to the very nature of magnitude itself is its discreteness and its continuity. Just like reality and negation drove the account of quality, here discreteness and continuity drive the analysis. Hegel's claim is it drives the account of quantity, must do so. He says because it's that, magnitude is necessarily quantitatively infinite. Quantitatively infinite. So there's a parallel between the arguments here, right? The argument in quality, the argument in quantity. They're not the same argument, but there's a parallel between them, right? Hegel wants to say, look, just like within quality, there is this structure of reality and negation, and it led to qualitative infinity and two forms of that. We're going to see that happen again here because discreteness and continuity are going to give us certain determinations, we'll walk through those, that are going to lead to the conclusion, the necessary conclusion, that there is in magnitude itself a kind of infinity at work. Not the same infinity, right? Qualitative and quantitative infinity are not the same thing, but they are closely related in the sense that they have the same structures. Right? That they do bear in common. So as I read it, to get to that conclusion, Roberto said, to show that that's what is entailed here, Hegel's going to take us through 3 steps, right? Unpacking what it is for magnitude to be at once discrete and at the same time continuous. So let's start with that first step, just the notion of pure quantity. So here's the first chapter, which is about this notion of discreteness and continuity. The continuity of magnitude, this is a little hard to get sometimes, but I think it's really crucial because Hegel comes back to it repeatedly. The continuity, so the attraction of magnitude, what's holding it together. It limits or constrains its discreteness. So no matter how much repulsion is going on, no matter how much negation is going on within magnitude, giving us discrete entities, those entities are all born together, held together, they're attracted to one another, they are one by virtue of being magnitudes. They are quantum. They are quantum. So the oneness of quantity confines its manyness, you could say. The oneness of quantity, its continuity, confines, constricts, limits its manyness. And yet, as discrete, magnitude always and necessarily transcends or goes beyond the limits set by that continuity. Here we have again, right? Reality and negation set up this dynamic. We see it here again in quantity, where discreteness, which is repulsion, it's negation, is always within continuity, constrained by it, limited by it, held within it, but also forcing itself beyond any constraint that continuity might place upon it. So, as he says at one point, Hegel does, pure quantity is nothing other than that contradiction, that relation of continuity and discreteness. That's all it is. That's what it defines it. Like Dasein, like existence was defined by reality and negation, magnitude, quantity, is defined by sheerly nothing other than discreteness and continuity, the most bare determinations that it has. Remember, a moment ago, it had no determination. Now it has these two moments of determination, discreteness and continuity. And that contradiction, that relation of continuity and discreteness, is the limit or the boundary of quantity. And that limit or boundary, he says, is always a quantum, a quantitative something, a being, an entity, we could say, as opposed to the quality of simply being real, of simply existing. Here we now have an entity for the first time. So the first step in this proof that magnitude is necessarily infinite is thus the demonstration that quantity is necessarily, by virtue of its inherent contradiction between discreteness and continuity, always a quantity, a quantum. Magnitude is quantum, he says. That's the first step. Magnitude is quantum. So I'm trying to break this down into steps so you can think, okay, I think I get that one. Right? I think I see that move that he's made there. Okay, fine. Well, that allows him then to start talking about quantum as number. We talked about this last time. So just to remind ourselves, right? By number, he doesn't mean a symbol that we ascribe to mass or magnitude. He means by it literally something that exists. So quantum is number, he says. He says this on 169 right at the top, 194 in the German. Quantum is number. That's what, it's both discrete and continuous. It's number one. Because as number, it captures both of those moments. As number, it is at once a sum, an amount, Anzahl. It is discrete in that sense. It's a sum, an amount, and that's a result of repulsion. Right? That's the mark of its being an entity, one single magnitude over against others. But number is also a unit, a component. That's its continuity. It's part of the number line, right? It's part of the continuity of it, right? So there's its attraction. So number, you could say, is the name for the contradiction that quantum has revealed itself to be. So on 170, 195 in the German, 170, the last lines of the middle paragraph on 170. He talks about number as at once discrete, it's an amount, Anzahl, and it's continuous, it's a unit, a component, Einheit, right, it's oneness. He writes this. This is the last lines of the middle paragraph on 170 in the English, 195 in the German. This intrinsic contradiction of number or of quantum is the, and this ought to surprise you, quality of quantum. So, well, we're finished with quality. That's back in that previous section, right? We're not talking about quality. He's obviously made a mistake here. He should not have written, this is the quality of anything, because we're done with quality. Quality's over with. Well, we're not done with quality. This isn't a mistake. This is right on target. He's about to come back and go over this repeatedly. He's just acknowledging it here. So think about it with me for just a moment. He writes, this intrinsic contradiction of number or quantum is the quality of quantum. What does he mean by quality here? That's what we want to think about in just a second. He then says, and the contradiction will develop in the further determinations of this quality. So twice he says that this numbering, right, that it's both discrete and continuous, that it's both a sum and an amount, but also a component, a unit. He's saying that's the quality of quantum. And I think what he means by quality here is not wholly distinct from what he had talked about when he talked about quality originally. Quality means the reality of something. And he's saying this is what it is to be real as a magnitude. To be real as magnitude is for it to have this bifurcated, contradictory, conflictual nature born within it. It just is this. And what he's wanting to say is that's its reality. That's its realness. That's when things exist as an entity. Every entity has within it this conflict of being assigned as an amount. So it's, we could say, the result of other things being aggregated together, or maybe it's the prime one itself, right? You can do it that way. But also it can be added to all the others. It can be included in all the others. So it's at one and the same time, discrete can stand on its own, but by virtue of the fact that it can stand on its own, it also stands with the continuous line itself. It's negated, one stands alone, discrete, but it's also attracted. It's attracted to the line of quantity itself. Now then he explores that. Okay, well then that means, he says, that number is not just the truth, the quality, right, of quantity. But he says that means that number has to be degree. He's about to make this do a lot of work. He's about to say that this does a lot of work, so it's worth settling down here for a moment, trying to think about what does he mean by degree. Degree is just a way for him to say they bear an intrinsic relationship to one another. Degree is just a way of saying that discreteness and continuity are not just two separate figures, I mean by that mathematical numbers. One a sum, the other a unit. But they're actually degrees of one another. Or they represent different degrees, let's put it that way. So we'll say, look, if we want to think about degree, and degree has got this discreteness and continuity built into it, it has to, it's naming that. Just as number did, degree is an expansion of that, right, development of that. Then we can say, well, that the discreteness of number, the discreteness is a what he calls an extensive degree, an extensive degree. It's a degree of something else, right? That's his way of saying number, as discrete, always bears relationship to continuity. So it's extensive degree of, you need to hear degree as degree of something. There's no degrees in itself, right? It's degree of something else. But what is a degree of? Well, it's a degree of, it's a unit in a continuous line. What's that continuity then? It's not extensive degree or extensive magnitude, it's intensive degree, because it's development by degree itself. Rather than standing outside of the line itself, extensive degree, it's standing within it. So quantum quad discrete is extensive magnitude, quantum quad continuous is intensive magnitude. Everybody okay? So he says, at that point, you can say this. This is on page 183, 210 in the German, 183 in the English, 210 in the German. He says, then we can say that not only is magnitude quantum, and quantum is necessarily a number, and number is necessarily a degree. That's just kind of reminding us of the steps by which we got here. But you have to say that what magnitude is, it wasn't this when we first introduced it. Remember, when we first introduced it, it was indeterminacy, right? It was a blob, a mass. Had no distinguishing marks about it. But now by showing that it has this discreteness and continuity built into it and defining of it, we can say that it is a graduated continuum, an increasing and diminishing scale of degree. That's what magnitude is. So it's not wholly vacuously indeterminate. It has degrees to it. Those degrees are continuous with one another. So far, so good. Buy that much? Because now you're going to buy something huge, right? Because here's where Hegel's going to go with this, right? If it's a graduated continuum, then what does every discreteness mean? It means it goes beyond every degree that it has. And it can do that, you know where this is headed, ad infinitum. Here's the way he puts it. This is on page 189 at the bottom. 189 over the top of 190, 189 at the bottom over the top of 190, this is 218 in the German. And this is the result of the analysis. So I'll come back and fill in the analysis, but here's the result of it. Thus, quantum sends itself beyond itself. Sends itself, this is literally the same language he used about quality. Quality sends itself beyond itself. It othered itself, right? It ought to be other, and he's going to have a language that's going to be quite close to ought language again here for quantity. It oughts itself, it others itself beyond its own restrictedness. Why? Because it's always something that is continuous, yes, but it's always repulsing from that continuity, from that attraction. It always discretes itself over against this continuity. So it sends itself beyond itself. He's already used that language on the paragraph just before this. This other which it becomes is at first itself a quantum. What else could it be? It doesn't become something else other than it's another quantum. That's all it can be. But a quantum which is not a static limit. Here we come back to this Grenza-Schrodke problem, right? It's constricting, right, to say, well, it's a degree along this continuity, but now it's going to transcend, go beyond that limitation, that Schrodke, that Grenza is going to become a Schrodke for it. It's going to move past that. It's going to send itself beyond that. He says, but a quantum which is not a static limit, but one that impales itself beyond itself. Impales itself beyond itself. The limit that arises in this beyond is therefore only one that again sublates itself and sends itself, no surprise here, to a further limit. So here's interminable negation, right? Every time you have a mass and you think, okay, here's its degree, it's going from, I'm making things up arbitrarily, from 1 to 10. When it reaches 10, it doesn't go, well, I'm done. That's as far as I want to go. Because, the repulsion's over, right? I'm done now. No, repulsion's not incidental, it's not weighing on the completion, none of that. It negates itself again. And it does what? It sends itself beyond that 10 limit that we arbitrarily prescribed and said, this is where it goes and no further. I said, this is what we do. It actually, that's what the nature of the beast is itself, what the nature of magnitude is itself. It looks like it's set a limit on it, but that limit is always to be gone beyond. And if it's always to be gone beyond, then the next one that gets set, okay, it's not 10, it's 15. Oops, it's not 15, it's 20. Oh, then so on ad infinitum, so on to infinity. So Hegel's claim is that because magnitude is quantum and quantum is number and number is degree, that it necessarily is infinite. That's just born out of the very nature of what it is to be quantitative. Quantitative determinacy has quantitative infinity built into it. Can't not be that. So the third and final step then in that systematic proof that magnitude is necessarily infinite is thus the demonstration that as degree, quantum necessarily transcends any limit, making of it a barrier, a restriction or limitation to be moved beyond from one degree to the next, whether higher or lower at this point. So you can go up one end of the scale, the continuous, continuum, or you can go back down the other end. And so Hegel will say, this is on page 189 through 190, that degree then is necessarily alteration. Now, if you'll remember, quality was necessarily change as well. Right? One, not because something happened to it from outside, not because something was imposed upon it, but because that was basic to its own very nature. Right? What it is always to be afflicted with non-being, to be afflicted with negation. And that means that always, no matter where it's settled, no matter what the something was, that quality came to be as a self-related moment of reality. It was always going to be undermined in that very moment. So it was always going to be in change, in process. Welcome back to the qualitative, deeper notion of becoming. Here we get to the quantitative, deeper understanding of becoming. Because now all magnitude, because it's discrete and continuous, is necessarily overturning every settled moment, every settled degree that you get, every settled extensive magnitude that you get, extensive degree that you get, is constantly going to be overturning the next one and the next one and the next one. So what do you get? You get alterations, he says. All right. So it's always good at this point, I think, to stop and step back and say, okay, What just happened? What did Hegel just show? And what he's telling you he's shown, we can evaluate, we'll see if we find it convincing or not, is that magnitude begins as completely and wholly indifferent to its increase or its diminishment. Doesn't matter. And yet what you find is that it's necessarily determined, not by something else, but by its own self, intrinsic to itself. Notice, negation doesn't happen without here, right? It can't. It's born within magnitude itself now. And what that does to magnitude is it makes of it quantum. That makes of it a number. That numbering of it makes it what? Makes it a degree. Those degrees necessarily mean that it's going to overturn itself. And that means that that magnitude necessarily changes. And the changing of magnitude we name infinity. The changing of just like the changing of quality, we name qualitative infinity. Here this changes, the quantitative change is quantitative infinity. So on 192 and then on 203, he lays out two forms as he had with qualitative infinity. He thinks the same analysis works here in a different domain, right? We're talking quantity here, not quality. But it does have the same structural setup. There's two forms of quantitative infinity. So quantitative infinity can be the beyond, that is the non-finite, as he puts it here, either the smallest or the largest. So graduated increase, infinity as the largest. We asymptotically approach that, right? From 10 to 15 to 20 to wherever. But we can also go to the smallest, the infinitesimal, the smallest, graduated diminishment. He says either one of those on 192, right in the middle of that page, 192, it's 222 in the German. He's saying either one of those you can think of as a non-finite. It's what's other than beyond the finite, either beyond in the sense of greatest, largest, or beyond the sense of smallest. And that's why you have a, 40-page discussion in the remarks about calculus at that point, right? Because the infinitesimal is what calculus, one of the things it's fundamentally about. And that's why Hegel says, okay, let's take 40 pages and try to show why that's useful but not ultimately the truth of magnitude itself. As we're about to see, this form of spurious or beyond infinity, right? Static form of infinity, is, as I said about qualitative infinity, true. There is really a beyond. Right? There is really a maximal big and a maximal small. Minimal small. Those things are real, right? As Hegelians, as I said before about qualitative infinity, it bears repeating here. We tend to say, well, that's bad and spurious, and don't believe the hype and don't believe the myth and all the lies about that. I think it's important to say Hegel's actually saying, no, that ontologically real they are. They are absolutely ontologically real. But they're static moments in what's ultimately underlying them, which is a process. So what he says on 203, 235 to 236 in the German, is that quantitative infinity makes possible this non-finite infinity, beyond infinity, because it's a process. It's a self-relational process. It's a movement of magnitude that's intrinsic to magnitude itself. It's not something that magnitude's caught up in. It's something that's immanent within magnitude itself. It's not something you do to masses. It's not something you do to magnitude. It's what magnitude does to itself. Just like quality does this to itself, so magnitude does this to itself. What does it do to itself? It comes to be itself by becoming other than itself. Or, to put it in the language we've used prior to this, its discrete moments are the products of its continuity. And its continuity is the product of its discretion. So he says on 203, in the second to last paragraph there, 203 in the translation, second to last paragraph. This is 235 to 236, I think, right there in the German. Here's one of these summary passages, and you want to, as I said before, hold on to these, because here's where Hegel says, here's what I've shown. And it's useful to us to mark those. He doesn't always mark them and say, now let me show you what I've shown. He just does it, right? And he expects for you, when he clusters all these terms together, to be recognizing, oh yeah, that's retracing our steps. But notice what he does here. If you've done this, you know he is retracing the steps. And look what he takes away from it. He says, 203, second to last paragraph, is 235, 236 in the German. Quite generally, he says, quantum is sublated quality. So here's this quick and cliff note version of how we're going to get this whole argument unfolded. Quantum is sublated quality, but quantum is infinite. So notice we don't get the number, we don't get the degree stuff. That's all packed in here, right? That's how you get to, but quantum is infinite. Then he reminds us what infinite means, right? It surpasses itself, right? But that can mean it surpasses itself, go maximal or go minimal. It can go the largest or the greatest or the smallest, infinitesimal, right? You can go either one of those ways. That's at least what that means. So that's spurious or bad infinity. But notice what he does with it. He says, it surpasses itself, is the negation of itself. This, its surpassing, is therefore in itself the negation of the negated quality. There's that strange term. What's it doing here again? The restoration of it. So now it's coming to be itself, right? That's what that at least means. The restoration, it comes to be itself. And what is posited is that the externality, which seemed to be a beyond, seemed to be what we would call spurious or bad infinite, here in the quantitative, is determined as quantum's own or proper moment. So infinitizing as a process is generative of magnitude, quantity itself. Make some sense? So we went in thinking, just to be very caricature, but so we can at least catch the point going through. We went into quantity thinking, oh, it's just a mass. Just a big, huge block. And then we begin to notice that it has determinations that are built into it. Those determinations entail certain things about it, namely that it's quantum, that it's number, that it's degree. Okay, fine. And then we see, oh, wait a minute, that actually means that it's got built into it certain relations of discreteness and continuity that are interdependent on one another. You can't have one without the other. And for most of the world, when they think about Hegel, as we've said before, that's usually where we stop, right? One moment, another moment, interdependent on one another, reciprocal determination of one another, intrinsically related to one another, we're done. That's not where Hegel stops. Hegel says, yeah, that's right. They are interdependent upon one another, they're reciprocal determinations of one another. But then he immediately says, where'd that come from? Where'd what come from? Where'd the relata come from? Where did discreteness and continuity come from? And where did their relationality to one another, their necessarily reciprocal determination, where'd that come from? It came from a process that's endemic and productive of them both. So that moment of quantitative infinitizing, that quantitative infinity, is this moment of where it comes back to itself, it restores itself, it comes to be itself. So we started with magnitude as a mass. But what we end with, or at least we get to here, is that magnitude is a self-productive process, a self-engendering process. Just like reality is self-engendering, so magnitude is self-engendering. Now, if we buy that, that's a huge claim to buy, right? That is, if you were just reading this, it doesn't really matter when you're reading this. If you're reading this back, certainly in Hegel's day, prior to Hegel, just prior to Hegel, or certainly afterwards, you go, Hegel. I don't know if you've heard, but matter is dead. Matter's dead. It's inert. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't have any of this crazy, the mass thing, right, we're there. Aristotle told us, right? Matter's dead. It's recalcitrant. You have to put form on it to get anything going with it. I'm being a caricature of Aristotle. Sorry for the much more sophisticated reading of Aristotle you can do. But at least in the history of philosophy, that's one way of reading, prominent way of reading Aristotle. And so matter is inert, doesn't have anything of its own. It's, it's just quantitative, but who cares about quantitative? It's significant stuff when you get hit with it, hurts, but really that's about it. It doesn't have anything of its own. It doesn't have a process that's intrinsic that generates itself. That's what he's claiming. Is that if you unpack it in terms of a discreteness and continuity, then it's engendering of itself. It's a process, not a blob. Let's put it in the terms I've used here. Now, if that makes some sense, and as I said, that's a lot to question there, a lot worthy of questioning there, right? But if that makes any sense, then I'd like to touch on this last bit he says here, right there, right at 203 where it ended. He says, I just have to do the whole sentence again. Quite generally, quantum is sublated quality, but quantum is infinite, it surpasses itself, is a negation of itself. This is surpassing, is therefore in itself the negation of the negated quality, the restoration of it, and what is supposited is that the externality, which seemed to be a beyond, is determined as quantum's own or proper moment. Now what I want to pull out of there is that equation that Hegel is making between quality and quantity's own proper moment. Because every time he's come back and said, this is what quantity is, its own proper moment, what makes it what it is. We would standardly call, oh, that's its essence. Right? That's how we read that, right? We would say, oh, now we've got what makes that thing what it is. And as we know from Father Plato, that is the essence of something. And Hegel says, as I've said before, slow that train down. We're nowhere near that. All we've got here is the unique moment of something, and that is its quality, he says. So he's equating the distinctive moment of quantity with quality. And the only thing quality can mean at this point, the only thing systematically it has as its significance, is not primary or secondary quality, none of that's here, right? All it can mean is that's its reality. That's its reality. So for magnitude to be real, for it to exist, for it to have presence, is for it to be the result of and the ongoing working of this process of infinity. We've reached its quality now. Its quality as real. Now, the last paragraph on 203 over to 204 is a monster. But it's an important monster, so let's take a look at it. So next paragraph from where I just ended. Last paragraph on 203, this is 236 in the German, over to 204 in the English. He writes this: quantum is thus posited as repelled from itself. Everybody see where I'm at? So this is the movement from infinity to ratio. From infinity to relation, you could translate it for helpness, so you could translate it as that as well. Proportionality, all of those are fine. Right? But I think it's important to get this because it's hard enough to figure out what he's talking about with the ratios. But what you need to remember is each one of those ratios, whether you're talking about the direct, the inverse, or the ratio of powers, all of them are talking about infinity as a process. What does that mean? He says here, quantum is thus posited as repelled from itself. So it's always discrete, right? Quanta is continuous, yes, but it's always generating, it's engendering discrete magnitudes. Numbers that are real. Quantum is thus posited as repelled from itself, with the result that there are two quanta. What are the two quanta? Well, one of them is the degree and the form of amount. That's the intensive magnitude. That's the extensive magnitude. And its relation to the continuum, the scale of which it is a degree. So the extensive magnitude, sorry. So you have intensive and extensive, those are the two quanta. You have the discrete side, you have the continuity side still there. Then he says, these quanta, having just announced that they're there, right, there's two moments in the process of infinitizing, quantitative infinitizing. He says, they are, however, sublated. That's where we've gotten to. That's why we're not falling back into, oh, there's kind of interminable back and forth between them, and now we're just going to have quantitative bad infinity forever. No. There's two moments. They're sublated and they're standing distinct from one another on their own. They are necessarily interrelated to one another. We've been able to show that now. You can't have discreteness without continuity, continuity without discreteness. They're necessary for one another. So these quanta are, however, sublated. So via the self-relational circular movement of the true and quantitative infinity, the amount, the discrete, is the unit, continuous, and the unit, the continuous, is the amount. It's discrete. They are necessarily implicative of one another now. Then continuing on. These quanta, he says, are thus moments of one unity. Einheit. one unit. And this is the determinacy of quantum. They're parts of one another, right? But what really makes them parts of one another is that they are relata, that are bound together. So really we need to think about their, surprise, surprise, their relation to one another. Well, that's what ratio is. Ratio, proportion, for helpness, which oftentimes in Hegel we would just simply translate as intrinsic relation. It's used here in its mathematical vein, so we translate it as ratio, proportionality. But we could just translate it as intrinsic relation. That's how Hegel uses it all the time. He distinguishes it from Beziehung. Beziehung is any kind of relation. Anything that are associated with one another is Beziehung for Hegel. Verhältnis is when they have an intrinsic determination of one another. Well, that's what these two quanta, the intensive and the extensive magnitudes, those two quanta are necessarily implicative of one another, determinative of one another. So he says, these quanta are thus moments of one unit, and this is the determinacy of quantum. So to be quantitatively is to be the relation, that is the ratio between the discrete and the continuous, between the extensive and the intensive. Then he writes this. So this is after the hyphen. Quantum, you have self-referred. This drives me nuts in De Giovanni. That should be self-related. Self-referred sounds a little too, I guess, pointing back to itself. It's like a linguistic, which is how De Giovanni wants to take this stuff. But it really is just more basic than that. It's relation to itself. Right? So quantum self-related, as indifferent limit and hence qualitatively posited is the, so qualitatively positive. Catch that again, it's real. That's what he means, picking up on that language he's just introduced in the prior paragraph. He says, and hence qualitatively positive, is the quantitative relation or ratio, it's the proportion. The quantitative Verhältnis in German. So the proportion between the ratio, between the discrete and the continuous, between the extensive and the intensive, is what constitutes something quantitative as the sort of thing that it is, as the reality of it. So the ratio is the reality of magnitude. The ratio is, it's how magnitude exists. Magnitude doesn't just exist as discrete quanta, and doesn't just exist as intensive magnitudes, degrees, right? Intensive degrees. It doesn't just exist on a continuous line, a continuum, but it also doesn't exist as standalone moments. It exists as both of those, and particularly exists as the relation between the two. So it's a relation of quanta to one another, hence it's a proportionality. But it's a proportionality as two moments of one process. The generative process, the self-generative process, we call quantitative true infinity. So he says on, now we're going to jump over quite a bit in between because that's where the discussion of the mathematical remarks and stuff are. Take a look at 271. Beginning of the second paragraph down on 271, in ratio, quantum no longer has a merely indifferent determinateness. Everybody see where I'm at? That's 271, 310 in the German. He writes this, in ratio, in relation, Verhältnis. Quantum no longer has a merely indifferent determinateness. No longer has a merely indifferent determinateness. So he's telling you, he's going all the way back to the beginning of magnitude and saying, I know where we started. I know what was going on there. I know we didn't have determinacy there, but we sure do now. Where does that determinacy reside? Oh, well, it resides, we get it, Hegel, it resides in the discreteness, because those are discrete entities, that's determinative. And you know, yeah, they're related to one another through the continuity they all form. The really important thing is the discreteness. No. Just as much they are that continuity as well. They're both of those things, but more importantly, they're those things in relationship to one another. Well, we've just seen how that relationship to one another can go out one side, down the other side. It can go to maximal greatness, or largeness, or minimal infinitesimal. It can go either one of those ways. So he says this, in ratio, quantum no longer has a merely indifferent determinants, but is qualitatively, really, right, what it is as reality, determined as simply relating to its beyond. Relating to its beyond. That's code word. We know that. That's the bad form of infinity. So it's relating always beyond itself. It's constantly overcoming itself. That's the nature of magnitude itself. You don't have to do that to magnitude. Magnitude does that of itself. Then he says, look at this. Now this is down just a little bit. This is 271 still, but it's the last 5 lines of the second paragraph. So it's the last 5 lines of that paragraph where he writes, the quality of quantum, its conceptual determinateness. Everybody see where I'm at? Still in that same paragraph, just a little further down. The quality of quantum, its conceptual determinateness, we could say its reality, is its externality as such. Its externality, what does that mean? That it constantly overcomes itself. That it's constantly altering itself. So he's, at this moment, focusing on that first form of infinity. It always goes beyond itself. It's always either maximally large or maximally small. It's always going up and down the continuum, the number line that is magnitude itself. He says, the quality of quantity, its conceptual determinateness, is its externality as such. And for helpness, in ratio, in relation, in proportion, quantum is now posited as having its determinateness in this externality, in another quantum. So it always is other than itself, right? It's always another discrete entity, it's another number, right? It's not 5, it's 10, it's not 10, it's 15, it's that, right? As being in its beyond what it is. So you could say at that point, if you have to be careful about using this word, but I think it makes roughly the point. It's always surpassing itself. Right? It's always, here's the cautious word, transcending itself. It's not moving outside the domain of quantity, right? So it's not transcending quantity. But it is always transforming itself. It's in perpetual alteration of itself by virtue of itself. Again, this is not something that form does to it. This is something that happens by virtue of masses, quantities, magnitude's own inherent structure. So he says now on 271, the third line up from the third paragraph, so take a look, this is the third paragraph down, in the third line there, he says, quantum is not only, everybody see where I'm at, the sentence begins, this connection is itself also a magnitude. So now he's just said, look, you know what quantity is? It's magnitude. You know what magnitude is? It's discreteness and continuity. It's both of those quanta, right? But you know what it is? It's the relation between them, and that's a quanta too. Because you didn't get out of quantity yet, right? So even the relationality is going to be quantitative. So he says, this connection is itself also a magnitude. Quantum is not only in relation, which we've been showing, right? It's not only in relation, but he says, but is itself posited as relation, as proportion. So he's literally using both of the terms there, by the way. He says this connection there is biseum, right? So this relation, this seemingly extrinsic relation between the discrete and the continuous is also a magnitude. Quantum is not only in relation, that's for helpness, but is itself posited as a relation. So the quality of quantity is its necessary relation to that which is beyond it, its externality as such. That is, its relationality between its discreteness and its continuity. And hence, quantum is not just posited in a relation between quanta. It quite literally is, here's its reality, here's its quality. It is this relation, for this relation embodies the structure of quantitative infinity, its own proper, as he's just shown us, proper moment. So far, so good, makes some sense? I'm gonna be really quick with the proportionality here, because Hegel really wants, there's a lot to untangle here, so we can go back and go through a lot of this if you want. But the point he really wants to make here is that these ways of thinking about proportionality are ways of thinking about the relation, right, between the two quanta, between the intensive magnitude and the extensive magnitude. And what they show you is that they can have really no impact on one another, they can have negative impacts on one another, or ultimately what they really entail for one another is they are generative of one another. So there's the 3 moments, right? Here's the 3 kinds of ratio he goes through. He says first that you can have a direct ratio, right? A over B equals C. Right? Think about it that way, A over B equals C. So he says that for itself or explicitly the direct ratio where one term varies in direct proportion with another, and thus they have a constant ratio. Does not yet express the qualitative moment of quantity, so that's not really what quantity is. It's where we start because it's a relation where one increases, the other increases. Right? That's fair enough. And that keeps the constant, the ratio will be constant. Right? So it's A over B equals C. That's the way to formulate it, to produce it in a figure formulation. That means you've got a constant quantity going on here. But in itself, he says, already here, you have this relationship between discreteness and continuity. So you already have the negation, but it's not working as negation yet. It's not posited explicitly as negation. Where do you get that? You get that in the inverse ratio. The inverse ratio is precisely that. So 272 to 273, that's the direct ratio. That's 310 to 313 in the German. And then he says, this is on page 273, last 8 lines of the page on 273. I'll just highlight a couple of passages here. This is 273, sorry. Yeah. This is the last 8 lines. This is 313 in the German. He says this. Look at 8 lines up at the bottom. And since these two sides, everybody see where I'm at? And since these two sides? Since these two sides, so again, we're talking about intensive magnitude and extensive magnitude, two quanta. Right? And we're talking about their relationality to one another, their proportionality to one another. And since these two sides as quanta are indeed present as they should be in the explicated quantum in the Verhältnis, the relation, the ratio, but at the same time they have only the value proper to them as sides of the Verhältnis, of the relation of the ratio, of being incomplete quanta. So they can't stand on their own. They're incomplete. They're always in necessary relationship to the other. And of counting only as one of those qualitative moments, that is qualitative moments now, making that thing real, they are to be posited with this negation qualifying them. There you get it, right? That's what's not in direct proportion. It doesn't have negation positive. It's there, but it's not positive. It's not made explicit. So he says, thus there arises, because of that, because negation is there but has not yet been made explicit. Now we have to make it explicit. It's there, so we have to recognize that it's doing work. Thus there arises a more real Verhältnis, a more real proportion, more real ratio. One more in accordance with its definition, with its quality. One in which the exponent has the meaning of the product. So now the result, right, the exponent, A times B equals C, not A over B equals C. That's a constant exponent. Now we have an A times B equals C. There's the product of the sides. In this determinant, it is the inverse Verhältnis. When one increases, the other has to go down, right? They're going to offset one another, but they're going to have the same constant, right? They're negations of one another now. So we move from fixity of proportionality to alterability. Alterability. One changes, the other has to change. The negation of the quanta with respect to one another is posited as now intrinsic to the relata itself. So here we get the inverse ratio, the inverse proportion. This is on pages 274 to 277, 314 to 318 in the German. If one variable changes, either increases or decreases, the other does the opposite. Here's the inverse. The exponent, the quotient, the product, C in the formulation, right, A times B equals C, remains fixed or constant. They all are going to change, but what's going to remain constant is the exponent. We'll see that's the last thing to change, but it will eventually change. We'll have to. And yet the relata, that is the variables, are constantly changing in negative relation to one another. When one increases, the other necessarily decreases, and vice versa. The exponent, the quotient, the product here, is the unity of the two variables, the unity of discreteness and continuity. We haven't really gotten past that. We're still dealing with discreteness and continuity. It's the unity of the two variables that each approximates, but that each alone can never gain, right? They always are what they are, but always in the negative relationship to the other thing, right? So the two quanta are always offsetting one another, and that's what forms the product. For one of the variables to be equivalent to the exponent would require the other variable to be 0. We'd have to eliminate it. That's the only way to make that work. Well, then it wouldn't exist either, right? Because they're interdependent on one another. So Hegel writes at 276. This is end of the paragraph coming over from the previous page. So 276 is 316 in the German. Thus, each side is the contradiction between the determination as it's in itself, that is, as the unity of the whole, which is the exponent, and the determination as the moment of a ratio. This contradiction is, here we go, infinity again. Once you get them negating one another continually, what are you going to get? Bad infinity. It is at once bad infinity again, in a new form peculiar to it. So he's reminding you, right? This is not qualitative infinity, this is not quantitative infinity, this is a new form of quantitative infinity. This is the infinity now at the level of the ratio itself. Now to be thought of purely as, not the relata, constantly overturning each other, but now the ratio, the relation between them, is what's overturning continually. So the inverse ratio is always approached only asymptotically. It is the beyond and the limit of the quantum. He says this on 276. Now, in the movement from direct ratio to inverse ratio, Hegel's point is, wait a minute, the quanta relate to each other negatively. That's what's there but hasn't been acknowledged at the level of the relation itself. So that's how we move from direct to inverse. Inverse notes then the negativity that's inherent within it. In the move to the ratio of powers, he's saying, you know what's not been affected by negativity here yet? And it does, it's what produces it? The quotient, the product. What's it producing? How is it working? How is it producing that result? How is it producing the relation itself? Because that's what the quotient is. That's what the product is. It's that precise marking of that relation itself. So he says this. Take a look on 277. This is at the bottom of that page. It's 317 to 318 at the bottom of 277. Notice the focus now is on the exponent, the product of the relationship itself. He says the exponent is therefore neither a fixed constant nor an infinite product. It's not a beyond, but it's also not just a fixed constant. So it's not the beyond like we've seen it already in inverse ratio. It's also not the direct ratio that we saw, the fixed constant we saw in the direct ratio. Well, then what is it? He says, this is accordingly the negation of the externality of the exponent that is displayed in them. And the exponent, itself equally a quantum as such and also expanded or differentiated into quanta, is therefore posited as preserving itself in the negation of the indifferent subsistence or existence of the moments. As rejoining itself, that's the key line here. We haven't heard anything about rejoining itself, coming back to itself. We know that that means that this infinity, right, that generates this othering of the two quanta, when it comes back and rejoins itself, we know that's self-engendering process of infinity itself. As rejoining itself, and thus as the determinant in this movement of self-surpassing. The ratio is hereby determined as the ratio of powers. What is that, the ratio of powers? And he says that the ratio of powers means that alteration is not the passing over of something into a beyond. It's not where magnitude is continually passing over and passing over and passing over and passes over asymptotically into infinitely large or infinitely small. It's where each one of those passing over is a passing over of itself whereby it becomes itself. It's not constantly asymptotically trying to reach something beyond itself. Its being doesn't lie in its externality, whether that externality is maximally large or maximally small. Its being lies precisely in engendering itself in and through this process. So here we have the ratio of powers. A to A prime equals C. Or better said, A to the power of A equals C, I should say. So in the ratio of powers, in the proportionality of powers or in relation of powers, the variable A comes to be itself by being raised to higher and higher levels of itself. So it's coming to be itself in this process. It's not asymptotically trying to reach something beyond it, the greatest or the smallest. It's coming to be itself in and through this movement itself. So the ratio of powers is the way to think true infinity. True quantitative infinity is a matter of raising itself and thereby becoming itself. So the raising of the powers, literally the negating of itself whereby it comes to be itself. But that's transformation, yes. That's why it's constantly raising itself up. So in the ratio of powers, that is, quantity comes to be itself in and through surpassing, becoming other than itself. In this sense, discreteness, amount, and continuity, unit, the contradiction at the very core of quantity itself, are now, but only here, what they are in and through each other. We've seen them necessarily interdependent upon one another, but here finally in the ratio of power, they constitute one another. He writes, this is on 278, second to last sentence in the first paragraph on 278. He writes, the quantum as indifferent determinateness alters, changes. He's just reminding, right? I mean, that's, at this point, that's obvious, right? We're all agreed. To be is to be a quantum, to be quantum is to be discrete and continuous, and that means it's going to alter, right? Because it's going to overcome itself. No matter what discrete magnitude you get, it's always going to undermine that and overturn itself. So it's going to alter. But then he says, but inasmuch as the alteration is the raising to a power, raising to the power of the quantum itself, you could say, the otherness of the quantum is determined purely by itself. So it's not just othering itself to other itself to other itself. It's othering itself to be itself. He calls this on 278, right in the middle, the quantum is self-identical in its otherness. And again on 278, this is the end of the third paragraph down. He writes, he's talking about the quantum's otherness, the surpassing of itself in another quantum is determined through the quantum itself. That's what it does. It's determining itself, right, through its own othering of itself. He writes on 279, this is 8 lines down from the top on 279, this is 320 in the German. In the ratio of powers, quantum is present in the difference. If you just stop there, you'd say, well, yeah, I mean, there's difference all over the place here. But here, it's the difference of itself from itself. It is itself by virtue of becoming other than itself and coming to be itself in that moment of other. So in the ratio of powers, then, discreteness determines continuity, and continuity determines discreteness. We've been saying they're mutually implicative, they're mutually determining one another. Absolutely right. But now we're saying something more than that. We're saying that they're mutually constitutive of one another. That they're mutually dependent on one another is one thing. That you can't have one without the other, true. That's their mutual dependence on one another. And Hegel will always take you to that moment, right? He will show you what you thought could not be related to one another actually are necessarily related to one another. And because they're related to one another, you can't have one without the other. He'll show you that kind of stuff all the time. That's trivial for him. What he's much more interested in is why do those things actually have that necessary relation to one another? They have it because they're engendering of one another. So it's not just that thing needs the other thing, and, so better go find that other thing and put them together. Because they can't be defined except for where they're close to one another. No. His claim is that they have an intrinsic relation because the relata and the relation are engendered by a process whereby negativity is the othering of the thing so that the thing is what it is. And in the quantitative domain, quantitative infinity, that's expressed, captured in its relation, its proportion, its ratio, being a relation not of direct relata, not of direct proportionality, not of inverse proportionality. The first one's constant and static and rigid. The second one is about their negation of one another. But now they actually negate one another to become what they are. That's the raising of the thing into its own identity, to its ownness, to its own proper moment. Now, if that makes some sense, then look at what Hegel does. You might think brilliantly or frustratingly on 279, 320 of the term. And I'll introduce this, we'll take a break, and we'll come back and work on this for a while because it demands that. He says on 279, right at the beginning of the first full paragraph, by being thus posited, everybody see where I'm at? So posited in Hegel, we're going to obsess over this more next week, but let's go ahead and prepare for that. Posited has two senses in Hegel. Okay? And most often, not every time, you have to look at the context and see which one's more prominent, but most often he means both at the same time. So here's the two things it means. To be posited means to be made explicit. What had been implicit is going to be made explicit. A lot of times we'll say what was in itself has now been made for itself. Right? What was implicit in itself has been made explicit for itself. So that's one sense of positive. And that's true here. He's using it in that sense. What has been rendered, what was there always, right? What we've been noting was there, namely the work of negation, which is a productive work, right? It's not just the work of othering to other to other to other, right? Bad infinity. But it's the generative, self-determining work of negation, whereby something comes to be what it is. That's now been made explicit. But it also means, posited, also means something is produced. Something is produced. So whenever he says something is posited, you want to look, is he saying that something's become explicit? Does he also mean that something's been produced? Or does he just mean one or the other? Does he mean both? Lots of times, quite often, he means both. We tend to read him reductively by taking him to mean one of them. Usually we take him to mean made explicit. So when we hear Hegel say, something's been posited, we say, oh, it's been made explicit now. And that's true. You should absolutely hear it that way. But I'm just cautioning you to look carefully at context, because many times it means something more than just made explicit. It means also, in addition to that, he's telling you, we now see something that we thought wasn't produced is actually produced. It looked like it was a given, like it was just there. You know, like a mass. Like quantity. Doesn't matter if you increase it or diminish it, it's just freaking lays there. Hegel's saying, what we've now shown is that it's actually, we've made its negation, its negativity, its self-determining, self-generative negativity has been made explicit, and we see that now quantity is what? Positive. It's a product of that process. So, by being thus posited as it is in conformity to its concept, quantum has passed over into another determination. Or we can say that its determination is now also as the determinist, the in itself also as existence. He's gathering up everything now. This is all the way back to Dasein. And look at what he launches into. It is quantum insofar as the externality, the indifference of its determining, as we say, it is that which can be increased or decreased, is simply accepted and immediately posited, produced. It's just set out like that. It has become the other of itself, namely quality. I'm sorry. Did he just say quantity necessarily entails quality? Yeah, that's exactly what he said. The truth of quantity is quality. So we're not finished with it. Right, he's been telling us that all along. The reality of quantity is this process. This process now has a formulation, we can say, that's satisfactory to its own movement. That's the ratio of powers. So now quantitative infinitizing, sorry for the horrible Hegel jargon, but quantitative infinitizing is the ratio of powers. Now if you walk out in the street and tell people that, they're going to go, yeah, why? Why are you saying this to me? Why are you torturing me? But I think it can make some sense, right? Because the ratio of powers is the structure by which quantity comes to be what it is. It's what's engendering a quantity from within itself. It's not standing outside it and producing it. This isn't God saying, let there be quantity. This is quantity engendering its own self because of this process that's endemic to it. So he says, is simply accepted immediately positive. It has become the other of itself, namely quality. Insofar as that externality is now posited, made explicit, and as a product, as mediated by quantum itself, and hence as a moment of quantum. So that in the very externality, quantum refers itself to itself, is being as quality. Okay. Calm down, Hegel. You're excited because we can now say what the reality of quantity is, its quality. The reality of it is this process. Wonderful. Great. I'm glad you got to say that. Reminded us of that. So now we can say we've learned our lesson, right? We can all shut our books. Quality entails quality, and quantity entails quality. So we're done. You wish. Here's what he says. Now he unpacks this, right? What he does in the next paragraph down. At first, quantity as such thus appears in opposition to quality. So this is him rehearsing now the entirety of the argument up to this point. That's what he's about to do in this paragraph. He's just asserted a conclusion. And now he's going to remind you, here's the outline of the argument by which we reach this conclusion, that quantity is necessarily entails quality. At first, quantity as such thus appears in opposition to quality, but quantity is itself a quality. It's real in a certain way, right? It's a, it has a definiteness to it, it has a discreteness to it. self-referring, self-relating determinants as such, distinct from the determinants that is its other, from quality as such, except that quantity is not only a quality, but the truth of quality itself is quantity. Quality entail quantity, yeah. And quality has demonstrated itself as passing over into it. So now they pass over into one another? That's exactly right. Reality passes over into magnitude, magnitude passes over into reality. That's the larger way of translating that claim, right? To be is to be not only real, but it's to be a magnitude, and those necessarily pass over into one another. This Passover language sounds familiar, right? It's like being passes over into nothing, nothing passes over into being. Here we come at it at a deeper level. Quantity in its truth is instead the externality that has returned into itself, which is no longer indifferent by the way, right? He started off with it being indifferent. Now it's not indifferent to itself at all. It generates itself. That's what the ratio of powers was captured. Thus is quantity quality itself. Thus is quantity quality itself. In such a way that outside this determination, quality as such would yet not be anything at all. There's the line about there is no reality without magnitude. Right? That's literally what he just said. Right? There is no reality, quality, without magnitude, without quantity. For the totality to be positive, to be made explicit, right, but also to show how both moments, now quality and quantity, are both produced, a double transition is required. Not only the transition of one determinant into the other, I mean, in a certain sense, we thought that was the hard one to swallow, right? That quality was going to transition into quantity. That's bad. But now, quantity is going to transition into quality. There's your double transition. Not only the transition of one determinant into the other, but equally the transition of this other into the first. It's going back into it. Quantity goes back into quality. Through the first transition, the identity of the two is present at first only in itself. Here's the in itself. It's implicit. The identity. We don't see it yet. It kind of got buried, although it perked up every once in a while. We would say along the analysis of quantity, well, this is its quality. And we'd say, well, that doesn't belong here. But then we saw, okay, all he can mean by that is that here's its reality. But we don't really know what that reality consists in. Well, now we do, right? It consists in the self-engendering of quantity of itself. That's its reality. That's its quality. So, but through the first transition, the identity of the two is present at first only in itself. Quantity is contained in quality. But the latter still is only a one-sided determinants. Conversely, the quantity is equally contained in quality, that it is equally also only a sublet. This results in the second transition, going back into the first determinants, quantity going back into quality. This remark regarding the necessity of the double transition is everywhere of great importance for scientific method. That's Hegel saying, you know, whenever I show that there's an interdependence of two things upon one another, I'm also showing that they're entailing of one another. Because they entail one another, they're moments of a deeper process. It's significant. This is what I'm trying to do. Right? This is ultimately this is what the patience of observation has to wait and see. He's not forcing this upon it. He's literally saying, you know, and we could call him on this. We could say you're wrong about that. But what he's claiming is that to be is to be real. To be real because it's affected by negativity. We saw all the things that's entailed by that, and that ends up with what? Attraction and repulsion. And what is that? Well, that's quantity. And then you say, well, quantity, what's that? Discreteness and continuity. Where is that in infinity? Where does that entail? Quality. So they double transition into one another. You can't have quality without quantity. You can't have quantity without quality. Now, most of us would go, well, okay, Hegel. We got it. There's relata here. There's a relation here. We're done. Top of the next page, 280. Quantum is henceforth no longer an indifferent or external determination. Right, we got that. You showed us that, right? It's not indifferent to itself. Increase and diminishment, incredibly important to it. You know, the ratio is what literally takes the measure of that. But it's sublated as such, and it is a quality, and that by virtue of which anything is what it is. Okay. The truth of quantum is to be measured. Okay. I thought we were finished. This is always what we do, right? You're gonna, next week when we look at the end of the chapter on being will think, okay, we're finished. Because he'll give you that moment of this has come to its completion. But he's also going to show you it's not just that. It's something more than that. So what is measure? Measure is that quality and quantity set the limit to one another. Quality and quantity set the limit to one another. And you will not be surprised, I imagine, at this point to learn that that setting of the measure to one another is going to be a limit that's going to turn into a restriction. It's going to have to be overcome. To be is to be measure. To be is to be quality. To be is to be quantum. To be is to be measure. And to be measure is to be measureless. Measureless. Let me leave it there. We'll take a break, 4:37. We'll come back at 4:47, please. And we'll launch into talk about measure a little bit.